The Asian security architecture is slowly taking shape. And it's really, in a way, looking out into the mist of the future, trying to make some sense of those barely perceptible shapes. And the more one reads about this, the more one has a feeling that really everybody who's writing or talking about this is really, in some ways, revealing their own normative preferences and their theoretical predispositions rather than anything else. Because even the certainties of the present in some ways are clouded with a fair amount of doubt. China is rising, sure, but is its rise going to be sustained over the next 2 decades in the light of its own internal contradictions? India is emerging, certainly, but what about India's neighborhood policy? Is India going to continue to remain shackled by its unique blend of incapacity and indecision when it comes to its own neighborhood? Japan is normalizing, but can that process of normalization actually continue within this, given the scenario of demographic decline? Russia is resurgent, but to what extent is resurgence determined really by the level of global hydrocarbon prices and really nothing else? The US is a permanent presence in Asia, or is it? The US is also preponderant globally, but for how long will this preponderance really persist in the face of domestic mismanagement, which we are seeing, but also the fact of rising rivals who also happen to be partners in prosperity? When one thinks about all of this, at any rate, sort of remember the opening lines of, Little Hart's History of the First World War, the really haunting opening lines. He writes, 50 years were spent in the process of making Europe explosive. 5 days were enough to detonate it. I think there is something out here in European interstate politics during the half century preceding the outbreak of the First World War that those of us who are thinking about Asia should really, meditate about a bit. Because as we know, the two opposing axes that came to being in Europe were not designed for war. In fact, they were designed precisely to prevent war. They were designed for peace. These axes over time became so durable, they became so interlocking, in effect, that in retrospect, when we look back at 1914, the outbreak of war seems inevitable. And yet, of course, they weren't designed for that. An arrangement designed to give security, final result was what? Europe more insecure than it had been at any time since the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. So we really need to ask ourselves, are we living to something similar in Asia, or beginning to enter that period in Asia, what I am calling in this paper as the kindling years? The years, in effect, where there is a veneer of partial peace, there's the veneer of prospective prosperity, but there is really, in reality, a piling on of the combustible material for the conflagration that is going to sort of come and face us all sometime in the future. And that's the point. We don't know what will cause that conflagration. Who would have thought that the assassination of, in the Balkans would lead to the Great War? It did. The point was the raw material was already there. So it just needed something to spark it off. So are we in Asia, going through that as well? Now, what I do in this paper is really break it up into 2 parts. I first ponder a bit about the major Asian powers, and then think a little about what the future shape of Asia is going to be. The United States, obviously, it remains the obvious sort of launching pad when you're sort of trying to analyze world politics these days. And of course, the point out here is the preponderance of American power. The fact is that really, it was only way back in the high noon of the Victorian period, from 1860 to 1880, that you had a single state so dominating world politics in terms of sheer capabilities. The US, as we know, its military capabilities now are more than the next 16 or 17 countries combined. In all practical terms, the US is spending about half of the world's total military spending. The point is, if you look at what the United States is doing in Asia, you don't have to look too much at its deployments, just look at the tasks. Every single task that militaries have performed, the so-called Imperial Tasks, have been performed by the US military in Asia in recent years. To conquer, Iraq is a good example. To deter, you've got the Pacific Fleet, you've got the American forces in Japan and South Korea, you've got the American strategic bombers on Guam. To punish, that's another imperial task. The United States in Afghanistan. To police, Iraq again. And obviously, of all of these tasks, if you really were to analyze it, it's the policing task the United States is not doing particularly well. The impact of the US in Asia over the last few years has been really to wreak havoc with the status quo, which is a bit surprising given that obviously, systemically speaking, the United States is the preeminent status quo power. Plenty of reasons for that. Neoconservative politics, a certain grand strategy that has been termed somewhat provocatively as muscular dominance. The trinity of military dominance, preemptive action, and the war on terrorism in the Middle East. Also, curiously, the United States in some ways has been absent from Asia. I mean, it's present in terms of its capabilities, whether military, economic, cultural even. But in policy terms, most of the Bush years, the United States was basically absent from Asia. The focus was elsewhere. Asia may be becoming, as it were, the cockpit of world politics as the global balance of power shifts to the Asia-Pacific. But the central theater for the United States was the Middle East. So there was a complete disjuncture in that sense, as opposed to, say, the period of the Cold War, where the central theater and the cockpit both were sort of co-located. And it seems, when one thinks about the United States today, that the central challenge is really playing the role of an offshore balancer in a context in which its capabilities, while formidable in absolute terms, are in relative decline. What about China? I think China, when you think about China and Asia today, Sujit has already said a lot, but I think the central idea, as I see it, is centrality. Geostrategically, China really is Asia. There can be no Asia without China. China defines Asia. China is that one country that abuts or is a part of every single one of those other regions in Asia. China ties Asia together. Now, what happens, unless China implodes under the weight of its own internal contradictions, and there are several, but that seems a remote possibility, unless China gets weakened by a cross-straits crisis in the future, which again seems unlikely, in some ways dealing and coping with Chinese power is going to become the biggest challenge for pretty much all Asian states. Now, China's principal challenges in Asia, as I see them, are to prevent other major Asian states from balancing against it, and also to provide the incentives for the smaller Asian states to bandwagon with it. Both of these challenges, really require China to portray itself and portray its rise in particular as being benign and as being non-threatening. If you think about Japan, the word that comes to mind is normalization. The process that Koizumi kicked off is basically a process by which Japan slowly but surely is normalizing its role in the international order. In a strategic sense, this involves obviously a slow but yet steady expansion of the scope of its military activities. Shinzo Abe, after Koizumi, carried that process further, reasserted the whole normalization process, and obviously Abe resigning, Yasuo Fukuda coming in to some extent, has sort of slowed down that process. But most scholars of Japan say that the Yoshida Doctrine really in some ways is a thing of the past now. The fundamental challenges for Japan, of course, flow out from its twin concerns, one regarding Chinese aggressiveness, the other American dependability. What about Russia? Well, Russia was obviously, during the Soviet period, an Asian power. The question we need to ask is whether it still is an Asian power. In recent years, really, Russia has focused largely on European and North Atlantic developments and dynamics rather than on Asia. We need to consider some other factors as well. The decline, the complete deindustrialization of Russia, almost the physical stealing of industrial plant during the Yeltsin years. We have to consider also the rapidly declining, aging demographic profile of Russia. But on the other hand, we have Russia resurgent, during the Putin years, the high levels of global petroleum prices certainly strengthened Russian power. The most important reason why we should probably still consider Russia as a key Asian state is, of course, its arms transfer policy, which has a huge impact in terms of Asian balances of power. There have been huge, really large arms transfers. Don't have the time to go into those details, but I'm sure most of you are aware of them. Exports to China and India obviously form a very large proportion of Russia's arms exports. And so, in a way, Russia becomes then a critical player in terms of Asia. But it's amazing when you think about it compared to the Soviet Union, about how narrow the bandwidth is now of Russia's influence in Asia. You're really talking about the arms transfer relationship. You're probably talking about the energy relationship in its global dimension, and that's about it. It's a very, very different scenario from what it was earlier. India, well, India is an emerging power. Namely, it's one of those middle powers on the ascendant. It's one of those few states in the system that have signaled both its capability and intention to maneuver its way into great power status. I think India's biggest challenge is its neighborhood policy. Most emerging powers, I don't have time to go into it, but most emerging powers have tended to use their regions as launching pads. India, on the other hand, perceives of its region not as a launching pad, but almost in some ways as a drag anchor, something that's holding it back, something that's preventing it. There are several reasons for this, but there are two that sort of, I think, come immediately to mind. One, I think, has been India's consistent socioeconomic underperformance, both in absolute and relative terms. So in a way, there's been nothing really for the neighbors to, over the years, benefit from by closer relations with India. But I think more important than that has been, I think, a failure of a neighborhood vision, the inability to come up with a regional policy and to invest in it substantially. But also there's been the external factor of China. And what one means here really is that China has worked systematically to build strong political and economic links with all of India's neighbors. China has, therefore, in effect, presented to India's neighbor a feasible, an alternate incentive structure, if you will. And this alternate incentive structure, in a way, prevents the cohesion of India's neighborhood. Now, Chinese design, Indian default, but the net result of it really has been that India in some ways finds itself tied into a regional framework that is inimical to its interests and ambitions. I then in my paper talk about other significant states, Pakistan, Iran, Indonesia, and Australia, but I will not say much about this apart from a word about Pakistan, which I as an Indian analyst obviously am required to do to keep my club card. The biggest challenges for Pakistan, I think, really are three. One is to keep its links with both Washington and Beijing alive and vibrant. Secondly, to keep India's influence in Afghanistan to a minimum. And three, to keep India off balance with asymmetric strategies while leveraging its nuclear deterrent to prevent all-out war. So in a way, those are the three fundamental challenges that I see for Pakistan. Moving on quite rapidly to the second half of my paper, which is really looking at the emerging Asian scene. This is how I would see it, that the map of Asia is changing. It's changing slowly, but it's surely changing. And really, for the first time in Asian history, certainly for the first time since the end of European colonialism, we have a continent-wide security architecture emerging in the Asia Pacific. This is really, in some ways, a continent-wide security interdependence, and this has clearly linked to, I beg your pardon, it's clearly linked to the rise of China. Now, China's challenge, as I said, is convincing everybody else in Asia that its rise is not some 21st century version of Wilhelmine Germany seeking its place in the sun. That's China's challenge. There is a whole trend in Asian scholarship, scholars such as Kishore Mehboobi, for example, who really question whether we should be looking at Europe at all when we think about Asia. They really argue that Europe's past will not be Asia's future. Mehboobi suggests, for instance, that the rise of China merely indicates in some ways a reversion to pre-modern and pre-European Asian order. Basically, an order based on notions of hierarchy, based on notions of tributary relationship with China. And Mehboobi's argument would be, in some ways, all Asians recognize and understand this almost instinctively. Now, if this deep historical memory of Chinese ascendance truly exists in Asia, we can be sure about one thing standing here in New Delhi, which is that India does not share this memory. And India does not share this memory then because the Himalayas came in the way. So when it comes to the India-China relationship, maybe unlike other parts of Asia, even if we were to give Mehboobi his argument, India and China clearly met each other for the first time, as I see it, when Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru met. In other words, China and India first encounter each other really as two sovereign territorial post-colonial states. And I think this is important to emphasize because, at least for an Indian analyst, fundamentally what's going on here in Asia is sovereign territorial state politics ultimately. So we do need to take a cue, I would argue, from the historical processes that have over time built, wrought, constructed a region out of what was once a continent, namely the European continent. Something similar, I think, is going to be happening out here. If we are to be prudent, we would not bank upon the ability of Asia's ruling elites to avoid war due to wise leadership. If we are prudent, we would not overemphasize the ever-increasing interdependence across Asia as a guarantee against future conflict. As I suggested, when I started out, in some ways these could be the kindling years in Asia. The tinder is piling up. We are all carrying along blissfully unaware. Things basically seem okay, but there's a whole bunch of raw material out there being built because of differential growth rates, because of changes in configurations of power, and fundamentally logic, the dynamic of Westphalian territoriality will ultimately one day hit us all. So if all of this is true, then the political logic of realism, with its power balances and security dilemmas, continue to drive interstate politics in a large parts of Asia. If you think about it, if you look at the various regions of Asia, balance of power politics lies at the heart of all of these regions, with the possible exception of Southeast Asia. And I would be very hesitant to make even that exception. So the question really then is whether balance of power politics is going to rise from the regional to the continental level in Asia. I think over time it will. The logic of it is clear, and it's a logic we all instinctively recognize. But somehow we try to sort of obfuscate that logic. There's a logic really of the rise of China and future attempts somehow to deal with the rise of China. And what it's going to really mean is, and you can play, this is a parlor game, you can build all sorts of hypothetical axes in your mind. And it's only a parlor game at this stage. But the point is there is something happening out here. Now, apart from that, because I think that would be truly horrid. It would be dangerous for Asia. It would probably be dangerous for the world if we just allow balance of power politics, the logic of interstate politics, the logic of security dilemmas, to essentially determine what's going to happen in terms of the architecture. Because if that's so, what you're going to have is basically over time an Asia of opposing axes and really a clear balance of power considerations in politics. There are, however, two other options, two other cues that European history throws up for us. One is the notion of Asia evolving over time into a region managed by a directoire of great powers, a consortium, if you will, a condominium, something like the Concert of Europe. And the other idea is the idea of Asia as a region that can enmesh in a cooperative security arrangement, basically the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process, in effect, taking on over time its own Asian shape. What about the directoire? I think when you think about the whole notion of the directoire, we're really thinking about securing guarantees for stability and order from a group of Asian great powers acting in concert. The former Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov was the one who really kicked off this idea some years ago. The idea really being that if China, Russia, and India were to work together, they could actually counterbalance the assertive and increasingly offensive NATO. The idea really that the sheer mass of China, India, and Russia, could, if these three countries work in concert, lead to a world historical role actually has very respectable antecedents. Lenin talked about it, wrote about it way back in 1923 in Pravda. The Pentagon in the 1990s, wrote about the three transition states, and what they were talking about again were precisely these three countries, these three great Eurasian countries as they call them, Russia, China, and India. The notion, therefore, that these three countries taken together have system-transforming mass. What are the factors that will work against this? Well, first of all, are questions of economic growth rates, competitiveness, and cooperation. Simple question, would greater economic interaction and the inevitable competition that would follow lead to instability? Or would it lead to the discovery of a larger set of mutual interests? Then there are a second set of questions that relate to what may be called the socio-political dimension, such issues as social cohesion, national unity, territorial integrity. In terms of ethnopolitics, for example, think about Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Siberia, and India's northeast. All of these, in different ways, the policies of these three countries impinge upon impinge upon each other. They invariably have an impact on each other, often in very negative ways. Unresolved borders becomes another issue, though it's becoming less important, except in the India-China context. Differentials in economic and demographic growth rates, obviously. Then there are questions of ideology, politics, and stability. China's political system throws up a number of questions that I won't go into. Likewise, policy coherence in India becomes a significant issue. Despite Yeltsin, the question about the staying power of the Russian state, whether it will continue to occupy the commanding heights of state power, also becomes a question. And then finally, of course, there are developments outside China, India, and Russia that also will have their own impact. But I think apart from all of these questions, there's something deeper here. And the problem is this, that the directoire itself, the example of the Concert of Europe itself tells us one thing, which is that the concert either freezes up the security architecture. And by freezing up the security architecture, what you're doing is you're creating a security architecture that does not really reflect dynamic changes in capabilities and interests. That's one thing that a concert does. The other thing that and we've seen it to some extent, though it's not a concert in the context of the UN Security Council, that really certain decision makers really get frozen into space, even though over time capabilities and interests shift and change. But also, any directoire, I would suggest, over time gets divided internally on questions of change versus stability. And finally, I mean, the most important issue, would small states in 21st century Asia be willing to be pawns in great power games? Sure, small European states in the 19th century didn't have a choice. But today, I mean, I think given the way world politics has moved on since then, it will be very difficult to imagine in that sense a directoire really taking off. And finally, there is what is, of course, my normative preference. Unfortunately, Susan Sim isn't here, I'm sure she would have spoken on this at great length, and I would have had less time to speak, but since she isn't here, that's the cooperative security notion. Really the idea that you could try to create an alternate mechanism cooperatively over time, multilateral in a sense, with the great powers obviously leading, but the smaller states also playing a role and becoming a part of the exercise, that would contain Chinese power, I'm almost done, maintain stability in Asia, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't say very much about this, but I hope in the Q&A session, if somebody talks about this, and I'm sure there are two other presenters here, so I'm sure perhaps they will take this up. But really, to set up a cooperative security system takes a great deal of diplomatic effort, and a great deal of policy traction is needed for that to happen. I mean, the Helsinki process was, in every sense, a contentious process. We see the finished product today in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we sometimes forget the painful process through which that organization ultimately got created. But there's no reason to expect that such a process, such an architecture in Asia, a cooperative security architecture, would not be the product of a tortuous and contentious process. It would, but it would be well worth the effort if it could reduce the size of arsenals in Asia, if it could enmesh Chinese and American capabilities in Asia within a larger cooperative process, if it could lead to the evolution of a new and authentic Asian identity, if it could build habits of cooperative behavior on the Asian continent, maybe even in some future date, play some sort of a role in the democratization of China. But the basic point is going back to the whole notion of the kindling years. The best way to prevent future fires in Asia is to prevent the stockpiling of the kindling today. Thank you.